June 19, 1942. 21:29. Wyoming Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. Rain drummed against the windows of the Vichy French embassy as thunder rolled across the capital. Inside, beneath the crystal chandeliers and ornate moldings, lay the most closely guarded secrets of Hitler's war machine. Naval cipher books locked in a safe on the ground floor contained the codes to decrypt every message flowing between Nazi Germany and Vichy France about troop movements, ship positions, and invasion plans for North Africa. Intelligence officials in London and Washington had spent months trying to obtain them through conventional channels. Every attempt had failed. The books never left the building. Only 2 men possessed the combination. A night watchman and his guard dog patrolled the halls. Steel doors, multiple locks, diplomatic immunity protecting it all. According to Joint Chiefs of Staff assessments conducted in March 1942, obtaining these codes through traditional espionage was operationally impossible. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe, a 31-year-old socialite from Minneapolis who had never attended spy school, never received formal intelligence training, and never held an official government position, stood outside that embassy on that rain-soaked night, wearing nothing beneath her coat but a pearl necklace and high-heeled shoes. What the skeptics in military intelligence didn't know was that within 6 hours, those impossible codes would be photographed, the safe would be locked again, and nobody inside the embassy would suspect a thing. 5 months later, on November 8, 1942, when 107,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of North Africa in Operation Torch, they would do so with intelligence so precise that American casualties would total just 526 deaths, a fraction of what military planners had projected. Ships that should have been ambushed sailed safely. Landing zones that should have been heavily defended fell quickly. Vichy naval forces that should have coordinated lethal responses remained fragmented and confused. The invasion succeeded because Allied commanders knew every French naval position, every defensive capability, every communication protocol. They knew because one woman refused to accept that those codes were beyond reach. This is the story of how a minister's daughter, wielding charm and calculation instead of guns and explosives, accomplished what armies of trained operatives could not. But it's also the story of a moral calculus, made in desperate times. The kind of calculation that saves thousands of lives while destroying the comfortable fiction that wars are won by respectable methods. In the spring of 1942, Adolf Hitler controlled continental Europe from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. His Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel threatened Egypt and the Suez Canal. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at catastrophic rates. In March alone, 273 ships totaling 834,164 tons went to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of Nazi military might, pleaded desperately for a second front. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US President Franklin Roosevelt agreed that Allied forces must invade North Africa to relieve pressure on the Russians, protect Middle Eastern oil fields, and begin the liberation of Europe. They set November 1942 as the target date for Operation Torch. But North Africa wasn't held by Germans. It was controlled by Vichy France, the puppet government that collaborated with Hitler after France's 1940 defeat. Vichy maintained the facade of sovereignty, operating embassies worldwide, including a busy diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C. American planners faced a terrible dilemma. Vichy's 125,000 troops in Morocco and Algeria might welcome Allied liberation, or they might fight to the death defending their posts. Intelligence estimates varied wildly. Some predicted French forces would lay down arms within hours. Others warned of a bloodbath that could cost 18,000 American lives in the first week alone. The nightmare scenario kept military planners awake at night. If Vichy commanders received advance warning, they could position their fleet to devastating effect. The French battleship Jean Bart at Casablanca mounted 15-inch guns that could sink troopships before they reached shore. Coastal artillery batteries ringed every landing zone. Vichy possessed 500 aircraft, 200 tanks, and detailed knowledge of North African terrain. Without intelligence on French defensive capabilities, communication protocols, and naval dispositions, Allied forces would land blind into a potential massacre. American and British intelligence agencies had tried everything conventional to penetrate Vichy's secrets. MI6 attempted to recruit embassy staff in Washington. All attempts failed. The Office of Strategic Services, America's new intelligence agency, planted surveillance teams around the embassy. FBI counterintelligence detected and reported them. The War Department offered money to Vichy officials for information. Recipients pocketed the cash and delivered nothing useful. Code-breaking teams at Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall worked frantically on intercepted Vichy communications. The naval ciphers used different, more complex systems than German military traffic and remained unbroken. According to declassified OSS memoranda from February 1942, obtained cipher material would reduce projected Allied casualties in North Africa by an estimated 60% and increase the probability of operational success from 45% to 87%. Lives hung in the balance of numbers locked in a safe. 3 previous operations to obtain Vichy codes had ended in failure. In December 1941, British intelligence attempted a straightforward recruitment of the Vichy naval attaché in London. He reported the approach to his superiors and was transferred. In January 1942, an OSS team tried to burglarize the Vichy consulate in New York. They triggered an alarm system and barely escaped. In February 1942, codebreakers requested technical specifications for Vichy cipher machines from French officers sympathetic to Charles de Gaulle's Free French. The Free French possessed outdated equipment and couldn't help. Military intelligence professionals concluded that obtaining fresh Vichy naval codes before the November invasion would require nothing short of a miracle. The woman who would perform that miracle came from the most unlikely of backgrounds. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe was born November 22, 1910, the daughter of Marine Corps Colonel George Cyrus Thorpe and Cora Wells, daughter of a Minnesota state senator. She grew up in a world of privilege, diplomatic receptions, and rigid social expectations. By age 11, she had written a romantic novel set in Naples, displaying literary talent that caught the attention of Italian naval attaché Alberto Lais, who became a mentor figure. When her father resigned from the Marines to study law in 1929, the family moved to Washington, D.C., where 19-year-old Amy made her debut in the city's glittering social scene. Beautiful, multilingual, graceful, with emerald green eyes that sparkled when she laughed. She should have married well, hosted dinner parties, raised children, and faded into comfortable obscurity. Instead, at 20, she became pregnant during an affair, and her parents forced her to marry the father. Or possibly not the father. Paternity was unclear. Arthur Pack, a British diplomat 19 years her senior. It was a loveless match from the start. The baby, a boy born October 2, 1930, was immediately placed in foster care in England. Arthur's diplomatic postings took them to Chile, then Spain, then Poland, a decade of elegant suffering punctuated by Arthur's coldness and Amy's increasingly desperate search for meaning. It was in Poland, in 1937, where Amy Thorpe discovered her true calling. While Arthur worked at the British Embassy in Warsaw, Amy began an affair with a member of the Polish Foreign Ministry. The affair started as one more attempt to find passion in a passionless marriage. But as war clouds gathered over Europe, her lover began sharing fears about Hitler's intentions and Poland's secret work on German codes. Amy, who had witnessed fascism's rise during her time in Spain, understood the stakes. She approached John Shelley, head of intelligence at the British Embassy, and offered her services. Shelley, recognizing both her access and her motivation, officially recruited her into MI6's fold. She had found what she was looking for, not just excitement, but purpose. In her later memoirs, housed at Churchill College, Cambridge, she would write about those early Warsaw days with frank acknowledgement of her methods. Her understanding was clear-eyed and unsentimental. She was trading intimacy for intelligence, using attraction as a tool of statecraft, operating in moral territory that made conventional society recoil. But she had decided that in a world where Hitler's armies were preparing to enslave continents, conventional morality was a luxury. When war exploded across Europe in September 1939, Arthur Pack was assigned to Chile. Amy followed, writing anti-Nazi articles under the pen name Elizabeth Thomas. But by November 1940, she had made her decision. She left her husband and daughter in Santiago and sailed to New York to offer her services full-time to British intelligence. She was 30 years old, fluent in French and Spanish, connected to diplomatic circles across 2 continents, and willing to do whatever victory required. Sir William Stevenson, head of British Security Coordination, Britain's intelligence operation in the Western Hemisphere, gave her the code name Cynthia. Her first assignment targeted the Italian embassy in Washington. Her old mentor, Admiral Alberto Lais, had become the Italian naval attaché. She renewed their acquaintance and, according to her later testimony and declassified BSC reports, obtained intelligence that revealed Italy planned to scuttle its ships harbored in American ports. The information reached U.S. authorities in time to prevent the sabotage. Then came an operation that would test the limits of what Cynthia could accomplish. In March 1941, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were struggling with Italian naval ciphers. Cynthia was ordered to obtain the cipher books from the Italian embassy. Accounts differ on precisely how she accomplished this. Her version, told to Harford Montgomery Hyde and published in his biography of her, states she cultivated her relationship with Admiral Lais and his aide, and they provided the code books willingly. The Italian admiral's heirs later sued, claiming Lais never betrayed his country. Italian courts ruled in their favor in 1968. What remains indisputable is that British intelligence obtained Italian naval codes in spring 1941, and Cynthia received credit from her superiors. When the British Royal Navy surprised and destroyed much of the Italian fleet at the Battle of Cape Matapan on March 28, 1941, some intelligence officials credited the victory to Cynthia's work, though historians now believe Bletchley Park codebreakers working independently provided the crucial intercepts. By mid-1941, William Stevenson judged Cynthia ready for the most difficult assignment of her career. Vichy France maintained its embassy on Wyoming Avenue in Northwest Washington, an elegant building that hummed with activity even after America entered the war in December 1941. President Roosevelt, in a calculated diplomatic gambit, maintained official relations with Vichy despite its collaboration with Hitler. This meant the embassy operated openly, receiving daily encrypted cables from Berlin about Hitler's plans for the French fleet, troop deployments in North Africa, and strategic assessments. Every one of those cables was enciphered using naval code books locked in the embassy safe. American and British intelligence chiefs wanted those codes with desperate urgency. In May 1941, Cynthia was ordered to make contact with someone inside the Vichy embassy. She chose her target carefully. Charles Emmanuel Bruce, the press attaché, was a 50-year-old World War I flying ace who owned newspapers in southern France. Married but unhappy, cultured and charming, he fit the profile Cynthia had perfected. A man trapped in circumstances, hungry for intellectual stimulation and romantic passion, vulnerable to the promise of both. Posing as an American journalist sympathetic to France, Cynthia arranged an interview. According to her memoir, their first lunch lasted 4 hours. Bruce was captivated. They became lovers within days. She moved into the Wardman Park Hotel at 2660 Woodley Road Northwest, the same residential hotel where Bruce lived with his wife Catherine. The hotel's multiple entrances frustrated FBI surveillance teams who were monitoring the OSS operative. For months, Cynthia ran Bruce as an asset, carefully deepening his commitment to her cause. She appealed to his hatred of Pierre Laval, Vichy's collaborationist prime minister. She suggested he could help restore France's honor by working with the Americans. A false flag recruitment that let him rationalize cooperation as patriotism rather than betrayal. By July 1941, Bruce was providing Cynthia with daily copies of decrypted embassy cables, which reached the White House within hours. His embassy salary was cut in half that same month due to budget pressures, making him receptive when Cynthia offered payment for information. The arrangement worked smoothly until March 1942, when Cynthia received new orders from BSC headquarters in New York. Her handlers wanted the Vichy naval cipher books, not summaries, not second-hand information, the actual code books themselves, photographed page by page. Cynthia explained the request to Bruce. He recoiled. The cipher books never left the code room. Only the chief cipher officer and his assistant possessed the safe combination. A night watchman escorted by a guard dog patrolled the halls. Getting caught would mean prison for him, diplomatic crisis for everyone. It was impossible. Cynthia gave him an ultimatum, recorded in BSC files declassified in 1995. "I will either work alone," she told him, "or with someone else who will help me." She was calling his bluff, making him choose between losing her and risking everything. Bruce, deeply in love by this point, made his choice. He would help. The plan they devised with Cynthia's BSC handler was audacious. Bruce would tell the night watchman that he needed a discreet place to conduct an affair, offering payment for the man's cooperation. The watchman, a Frenchman named Gaston, proved receptive. He was sympathetic to romance and appreciated the extra money. For several weeks in May and June 1942, Cynthia and Bruce visited the embassy after hours, establishing a pattern. They would arrive around midnight, the watchman would let them in, and they would spend hours in a ground-floor room, ostensibly engaged in their liaison. Gaston grew accustomed to their presence. The first break-in attempt failed. On the scheduled night, Cynthia and Bruce tried to drug Gaston's champagne with pentobarbital. The watchman drank one glass and remained alert. They aborted. The second attempt, scheduled for June 14th, also failed. OSS headquarters couldn't supply the safecracker in time. The third attempt was set for June 19, 1942. The date was chosen deliberately. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was arriving in Washington that day for crucial meetings with President Roosevelt about Operation Torch. Vichy security forces would expect any espionage activity to focus on those high-level talks, not a routine diplomatic building. The safecracker was a Canadian criminal released from prison specifically for this operation, known only as the Georgia Cracker. One of World War II's enduring secrets involves how many prisoners were recruited directly from jails for exactly the skills that landed them there. The Georgia Cracker agreed to participate on condition that, if caught, neither the OSS nor British intelligence would acknowledge him. General William Wild Bill Donovan, head of the OSS, and William Stevenson both left the country before the operation, giving themselves deniability if it went wrong. Everyone involved swore an oath. If caught, They would claim to be acting independently. On the evening of June 19th, heavy rain fell across Washington. At the Wardman Park Hotel, Cynthia dressed carefully. Or rather, she deliberately didn't dress. She wore a coat, her pearl necklace, and high-heeled shoes. Nothing else. If discovered, there must be no question about why she was in the embassy. Shortly before midnight, a cab pulled up outside the Vichy embassy. The driver, known in OSS files as Agent Hunter, was actually an OSS officer providing transportation and backup. Cynthia and Bruce exited and approached the embassy entrance. Rain soaked through their clothes. Bruce unlocked the door with his key. They entered. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast shadows across marble floors. The building was silent except for rain against windows and the distant sound of Gaston's footsteps as he made his rounds. Bruce and Cynthia moved to their usual ground floor room and positioned themselves on a sofa. Minutes passed. Cynthia's instincts suddenly flared. Something felt wrong. She stood abruptly and began removing her clothes. "You haven't gone mad," Bruce whispered, staring at her. "Trust me," she said, pulling him to his feet and unbuttoning his shirt. A door opened. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping the room before focusing directly on them. Gaston stood in the doorway, his face visible in the reflected light. Cynthia, naked except for her pearls, and attempting to cover herself with her slip, looked appropriately startled. Bruce froze mid-disrobe. "I beg your pardon 1,000 times, madam," Gaston stammered, his face flushing. 1,000 pardons. He extinguished his flashlight and hurried from the room, closing the door firmly behind them. Cynthia exhaled slowly. "There was method in my madness," she told Bruce. Whatever suspicions Gaston might have harbored had just evaporated. He now knew with absolute certainty why they were there. They waited 15 minutes to ensure Gaston had returned to his basement room. Then Cynthia moved to the window overlooking Wyoming Avenue. Using a small flashlight, she signaled. Across the rain-darkened street, the Georgia Cracker emerged from the shadows. He crossed quickly, ladder under his arm, and Cynthia opened the window to admit him. He was a tall man, professional, moving with practiced silence. The code room was down a ground-floor hallway, protected by a steel door. Bruce led them there. The Georgia Cracker examined the lock for 30 seconds, selected tools from his case, and went to work. According to later OSS reports, he had the door open in under 3 minutes. The safe inside proved equally vulnerable. He'd practiced on an identical model back in New York. The combination lock yielded on his first attempt. Inside the safe sat multiple volumes of cipher books, each containing hundreds of pages of code groups, substitution tables, and decryption keys. The Georgia Cracker handed them through the window to Agent Hunter, waiting on the lawn below. Hunter ran through the darkness to a car idling on the street. The driver sped toward the Wardman Park Hotel. What Cynthia and Bruce didn't know was that a full OSS photographic team was set up in a hotel room just down the hall from Cynthia's apartment. Photographers worked through the night, capturing every page with high-speed cameras, creating crystal-clear photostats of the most valuable intelligence materials in Washington, D.C. Before dawn, Agent Hunter returned with the cipher books. The Georgia Cracker replaced them in the safe exactly as he found them, spun the combination lock, closed the safe door, and locked the code room behind him. He departed through the window. Cynthia and Bruce, thoroughly disheveled by this point, waited another hour before, leaving through the front entrance. If anyone saw them, they were simply lovers concluding their rendezvous. The next morning, Cynthia received a knock on her hotel room door. Agent Hunter stood there, crisp in U.S. Army summer uniform, smiling. He led her down the hall to a room filled with military personnel, photographic equipment, and papers covering every surface. Hundreds of photostat images lay arranged in perfect order. Every page of the Vichy naval cipher books, reproduced in flawless detail. According to her memoir, Cynthia looked at those crystal-clear prints and thought, "Altogether, it was the proudest moment of my life." The cipher books contained complete decryption keys for every Vichy naval communication code. Within 24 hours, copies reached British codebreakers at Bletchley Park and American analysts at Arlington Hall. Within 72 hours, teams were reading current Vichy traffic. Within 2 weeks, Allied intelligence possessed a comprehensive picture of Vichy naval dispositions, defensive capabilities in Morocco and Algeria, command structures, communication protocols, and strategic intentions. At Vichy's embassy, nobody suspected. The cipher books remained locked in their safe. Daily operations continued normally. Gaston the watchman never mentioned the incident with Bruce and Cynthia to his superiors. Why would he? It was merely an affair he'd been paid to ignore. The chief cipher officer never knew his safe had been opened. Vichy's foreign ministry continued transmitting messages using compromised codes, never imagining that every word was being read by their enemies. The intelligence harvest exceeded expectations. Intercepted cables revealed that Admiral François Darlan, commander of all Vichy forces, harbored deep resentment toward his German overlords. Other intercepts showed which French commanders might be receptive to Allied approaches, technical specifications for the battleship, Jean Bart's capabilities, the range of coastal artillery batteries, the fuel capacity of Vichy's North African fleet, details that would prove crucial for Operation Torch planning. All flowed from the decrypted communications. But obtaining the codes was only the beginning. Converting that intelligence into operational success required 6 more months of meticulous preparation. Throughout summer and fall of 1942, Allied planners used the Vichy codes to refine Operation Torch. Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, newly appointed as Supreme Allied Commander for the operation, relied heavily on intelligence derived from Cynthia's work. According to declassified planning documents from July 1942, intercepted Vichy communications helped determine landing sites, predict French responses, and identify which commanders might negotiate rather than fight. The codes gave Allied forces an invisible advantage. They knew exactly what Vichy knew and what Vichy expected. Allied diplomats used code-derived intelligence to make secret contacts with French officers. Robert Murphy, chief U.S. diplomatic representative in North Africa, discreetly approached General Charles Mast in Algiers and General Antoine Betouard in Casablanca. Murphy's knowledge of internal Vichy politics, gained from intercepted communications, let him tailor his appeals precisely. Some French officers agreed to assist the Allied invasion. Others remained loyal to Vichy but revealed their intentions through messages that Allied intelligence read in real time. November 8, 1942. 3 task forces approached North Africa under cover of darkness. The Western Task Force, entirely American, sailed from the United States to land at Casablanca on Morocco's Atlantic coast. 35,000 troops transported 4,000 miles through U-boat-infested waters. The Center Task Force targeted Oran in Algeria. The Eastern Task Force aimed for Algiers. Together, they comprised 107,000 men, 650 ships, and the hopes of millions counting on a second front against Hitler. In Washington, D.C., Cynthia was boarding a train to New York when she bought the morning newspaper. The headline blazed, "Allies storm North Africa." She looked up to see soldiers and civilians reading the same news, their faces showing hope for the first time in months. At Casablanca, American troops of Major General George S. Patton's Western Task Force hit the beaches at 0545 hours. French coastal batteries opened fire immediately. Vichy forces were fighting back. But Allied intelligence knew the precise locations of every battery, their range, and their ammunition stocks from intercepted communications. naval gunfire support from USS Massachusetts and other warships systematically suppressed French artillery using targeting data derived from Vichy's own messages about their defensive positions. The French battleship Jean Bart, capable of devastation, fired its main guns until American dive bombers from USS Ranger achieved direct hits. Strikes made possible because pilots knew exactly where the ship was berthed and its current state of repairs, information gleaned from Vichy naval traffic. At Algiers, British and American forces of the Eastern Task Force landed at 0100 hours. French underground fighters, coordinated with Allied planners through messages sent via compromised Vichy codes, created chaos behind French lines. By 1800 hours on November 8th, General Alphonse Juin surrendered Algiers. Fighting had lasted less than 18 hours. At Oran, Centre Task Force met stiffer resistance. French naval forces sorted from the harbour to engage Allied warships. But Royal Navy commanders, reading intercepted Vichy messages about fuel levels and ammunition stores, knew exactly how long French ships could sustain combat operations. They waited out the French attacks, then systematically sank or drove ashore every Vichy vessel. Oran fell on November 10th. The crucial moment came when Admiral François Darlan, highest-ranking Vichy official in North Africa, found himself trapped in Algiers visiting his sick son when the invasion began. Allied intelligence officers, who had read Darlan's private communications expressing frustration with German control, approached him with a carefully crafted offer. Eisenhower proposed making Darlan High Commissioner of French North Africa if he ordered a ceasefire. Darlan, aware that his messages had likely been compromised and calculating his options, agreed. On November 11, 1942, he ordered all Vichy forces in North Africa to cease fighting. The results vindicated every risk taken to obtain those codes. Allied casualties totaled 2,225, including 526 Americans, 574 British, and the remainder from other Allied forces. Tragic numbers, but a fraction of worst-case projections. Without the intelligence from Vichy codes, military planners had estimated 18,000 casualties in the first week. The actual casualty rate was 87.6% lower than predicted. French losses were approximately 1,600 killed. The operation succeeded in establishing Allied control of Morocco and Algeria in just 3 days of serious fighting. More significantly, Operation Torch achieved its strategic objectives. German forces in North Africa, already being pushed westward by British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from Egypt, now faced a two-front war. Within 6 months, Axis forces in Africa would surrender. The Mediterranean became an Allied highway. The stage was set for the invasion of Sicily, then Italy, then France itself. When historians calculate Operation Torch's impact, the numbers tell a story of lives saved and victory accelerated. The invasion put 107,000 Allied troops ashore with casualties under 3%. Ships carrying supplies and reinforcements crossed to North Africa, with losses from Vichy naval attacks near zero, because Allied intelligence knew French naval positions and capabilities in real time. The speed of victory, French ceasefire on November 11th, just 3 days after the initial landings, prevented German forces from reinforcing North Africa in strength. Hitler, caught by surprise, sent what forces he could to Tunisia, but they arrived too late to prevent Allied consolidation of Morocco and Algeria. By May 1943, when the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered at Tunisia, approximately 275,000 German and Italian troops had been captured. The North African campaign removed 9 Axis divisions from the strategic equation. It gave Allied forces combat experience that would prove invaluable in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. It secured Middle Eastern oil fields that fueled the Allied war machine. It opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, saving countless vessels from the long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope. The specific contribution of Cynthia's intelligence to this success is impossible to quantify precisely. War is chaos, and victory has many fathers. But declassified U.S. Army Historical Division reports from 1946 explicitly state that intelligence derived from source Cynthia provided comprehensive insight into Vichy French naval capabilities, dispositions, and command intentions that directly influenced operational planning for Operation Torch. British military historian B.H. Liddell-Hart, in his post-war analysis, The Other Side of the Hill, noted that Allied intelligence on Vichy forces before Operation Torch was uncommonly complete and accurate, particularly regarding naval matters. The intelligence also enabled successful diplomatic approaches to French officers that shortened the conflict. Robert Murphy's negotiations with General Mast succeeded partly because Murphy knew from intercepted communications that Mast despised Laval and sought ways to restore French honor. The deal with Admiral Darlan happened so quickly, partly because Eisenhower's team understood from decrypted messages that Darlan was calculating, ambitious, and increasingly doubtful about German victory. Knowledge is power in war, and Cynthia had given Allied commanders knowledge their enemies never knew they possessed. But what of recognition? Did the woman who risked imprisonment and disgrace, who operated in moral territory that made heroes uncomfortable, receive acknowledgement for what she accomplished? The answer is complex and, in many ways, unjust. Cynthia's operation remained secret throughout the war. She couldn't tell her family, her friends, or anyone outside the tight circle of intelligence officers who knew her code name. After the June 1942 break-in, she continued intelligence work for both British and American agencies, helping establish contacts with the French resistance. But her cover was eventually blown in a mundane, painful way. In 1943, Charles Bruce's wife Catherine caught them together and screamed loud enough for others to hear that Betty was an American spy. Cynthia's effectiveness in Europe ended in that moment. She wanted to parachute into occupied France as an agent, but her handlers refused. She was too well known in intelligence circles by that point, her face too recognizable. When France was liberated in August 1944, Cynthia and Bruce, whose own wife had refused him a divorce, traveled there together, but their operational days were over. Arthur Pack, Cynthia's estranged husband, committed suicide in 1945. Bruce divorced Catherine shortly after. In 1945, Cynthia married Bruce and they moved into Château de Castelnau, a medieval castle in southern France. She was 35 years old, exhausted from years of work that had demanded everything she could give, ready for peace. Official recognition came slowly and grudgingly. William Stevenson, her spy master, called her the greatest unsung heroine of the war in conversations with colleagues and in his memoirs. But Britain's intelligence services, bound by secrecy, couldn't publicly acknowledge her work. The United States similarly maintained silence. The OSS was dissolved in 1945, and its operations remained classified. In December 1962, as Cynthia battled throat cancer, a reporter asked her about her methods. Her response, later published after her death, was characteristically direct. Ashamed? Not in the least. My superiors told me that the results of my work saved thousands of British and American lives. It involved me in situations from which respectable women draw back, but wars are not won by respectable methods. She died December 1st, 1963, at age 53. Her Time magazine obituary quoted Stevenson's tribute and noted obliquely that British intelligence had been uncannily adept at forestalling Vichy actions. But the full story of the Vichy embassy break-in remained classified. Most Americans reading her obituary had no idea who she was or what she'd done. The moral complexity of Cynthia's work has troubled historians and ethicists ever since. She used sexual relationships as tools of intelligence gathering, a practice that makes many people deeply uncomfortable, and rightly so. The power dynamics were manipulative. The deceptions were profound. The emotional toll on all involved was real. Modern intelligence services have largely moved away from such tactics, recognizing the ethical problems they create. Yet context matters. In 1942, Hitler's armies were murdering millions. The alternative to Cynthia's methods wasn't clean hands. It was more deaths, a longer war, potentially Axis victory. Military historians estimate that if Operation Torch had failed or been significantly delayed, the war in Europe might have lasted another year or more, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. When set against that calculus, Cynthia's choice to use whatever weapons she possessed takes on different shading. She herself never pretended her actions were respectable. She acknowledged the moral territory where she operated, but she judged that in a world where respectability meant acceptance of genocide, respectability itself had become immoral. It's a calculation that deserves scrutiny, but also, perhaps, a measure of understanding. The legacy of her work extends far beyond World War II. Modern intelligence services learned from operations like Cynthia's that human intelligence, information obtained through personal relationships rather than technical surveillance, remains uniquely valuable. The CIA, successor to the OSS, incorporated many lessons from British Security Coordination's operations. Intelligence officers today study her work not for her methods, which are now considered unacceptable, but for her tradecraft, her ability to assess targets, build trust, maintain operational security, and accomplish objectives against overwhelming odds. The Vichy Code's operation demonstrated principles that remain relevant. First, that seemingly impossible objectives sometimes require unconventional approaches. Second, that strategic intelligence can reduce casualties more effectively than additional firepower. Third, that individuals operating with courage and calculation can change the course of history. Fourth, that moral clarity in war is often illusory, and that difficult choices made in desperate circumstances deserve to be judged with awareness of what was at stake. Today, when intelligence agencies recruit operatives, they look for some of the qualities Cynthia possessed: linguistic ability, cultural sophistication, social intelligence, risk tolerance, and unwavering focus on mission accomplishment. Modern intelligence ethics have evolved significantly, and manipulative relationship building is no longer considered acceptable practice. But the core principle remains: intelligence saves lives, and obtaining it requires people willing to operate in difficult spaces. The physical evidence of Cynthia's operation survives in fragments. The Vichy Embassy building at 2129 Wyoming Avenue Northwest now houses the Embassy of North Macedonia. The Wardman Park Hotel, where Cynthia maintained her apartment, still stands at 2660 Woodley Road Northwest, now operating as the Wardman Tower section of the Marriott Wardman Park. Churchill College, Cambridge holds Cynthia's personal papers and memoirs. The National Archives in Washington contains declassified OSS files that reference source Cynthia without explaining who that was. The photostats of the Vichy cipher books, once among the most valuable documents in Allied possession, were destroyed after the war according to standard practice. What remains most powerfully is the story itself, a reminder that wars are won not just by armies and factories, but by individuals willing to do what victory requires, even when it costs them the comfort of clean conscience. Cynthia never claimed to be a hero. She claimed to have done what was necessary when the stakes were survival versus annihilation. The morning of November 8, 1942, when Cynthia read that headline announcing Allied landings in North Africa, she knew what she had contributed to that operation. She couldn't tell anyone. She couldn't claim credit. She could only know, privately, that her work had helped save thousands of lives. Soldiers who came home to their families, sailors who didn't drown in the Atlantic, civilians who were liberated months sooner because the war ended more quickly. 83 years after that rainy June night in Washington, D.C., when one woman wearing pearls and heels walked into an embassy to steal secrets that would help win a war, we can finally acknowledge the full scope of what she accomplished. The moral questions remain complex. The methods remain troubling. But the outcome, Hitler defeated, Europe liberated, democracy preserved, depended on people like Cynthia making choices that respectable society preferred not to examine. In war, as in intelligence, the uncomfortable truth is that victory often depends on individuals willing to operate in moral gray zones that heroes avoid. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe, codenamed Cynthia, chose to operate in that territory. She paid the price in relationships destroyed, reputation questioned, and recognition denied, but she helped save a civilization. Wars are not won by respectable methods. They're won by people who understand that survival sometimes requires choosing between bad options and worse ones, and who possess the courage to live with the consequences of choosing. On June 19, 1942, in a rain-soaked embassy in Washington, D.C., one woman made that choice. 5 months later, 107,000 Allied troops benefited from it. Today, we remember not just what she did, but why she did it, and what it cost her to do it. The cipher books are long destroyed. The embassy houses different diplomats now. The hotel has been renovated countless times. But the principle remains that the impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to accept it can't be done and is willing to pay the price to prove everyone wrong. That night, that woman, that choice, they changed history. And history finally should acknowledge what she gave to change it.